Hello, and welcome to our latest Human Givens Ask the Expert podcast. I'm Julia Wellstead, and I'm part of the Human Givens team. Today, we'll be asking Emily Gajewski, why do adults and children self-harm? We're delighted to have Emily as our expert today. She's worked for over 24 years as a therapist, both within the NHS and privately, helping people to move on from even the most severe emotional difficulties. And she has a wealth of experience at helping people, especially moving on from self-harm. Most recently, Emily was employed as a lead occupational therapist in Sussex, where she developed a number of mental health services, working with a wide range of emotional difficulties, including psychosis and self-harm. Now, Emily is also a registered Human Givens practitioner, and she teaches our Overcoming Self-Harm one-day workshop for Human Givens College, and you can find the details of that on the Human Givens College website. Hi, Emily.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming to talk with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Fantastic. Well, Emily, we've got lots of questions. It's a very important topic. But first, can you tell us more about your work and when you first started to help people with self-harm, and perhaps a bit about how the Human Givens approach helps?
Yeah, sure. So my background's in occupational therapy in the NHS, and I remember very distinctly how I first came across Human Givens when I went on an anxiety management course taught by an occupational therapist, and during the course she talked about the rewind, and I just thought, wow, that sounds amazing. So
Yes.
I looked up Human Givens, and my first workshop was with Joe, and it was called Managing Anxiety Without Drugs, and it was in a packed auditorium in London. And so many people say about the Human Givens, it's like a light going on, really.
Yes.
And I've always loved my work. I've been extremely lucky, and I love being an OT. But once I had the Human Givens training, I felt like my effectiveness soared, really. And so I've done all kinds of stuff. But in the NHS, I did a lot of working with kind of severe and enduring mental health problems. And
Yes.
the work that kind of inspired me to really focus on self-harm and develop the workshop was my work with Sussex Partnership Trust, working in a women's mental health service there, where we work with women who there was a lot of despondency around. These were women that had been in the system, the mental health system and the prison system for a long time, and
Yes.
a lot of sort of helplessness around the whole situation. And I was really, blessed to be able to bring in the Human Givens approach to that service and work to create environments that really met emotional needs. So these women came from services where they were really stripped of opportunities to meet their emotional needs. Some of them were in sort of isolation situations where really your needs couldn't be less met.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So having that time to sort of rehumanize them, really.
Yes, and get them to understand the concept of needs.
Yeah,
Presumably.
exactly. Yeah, and we shaped the care plans. We called them recovery plans, but we shaped them around the emotional needs. So when we had kind of care, team meetings with the clients there, we literally went through their emotional needs and said, okay, how are you doing with this? What opportunities do you have to get your need for competency and achievement met, or connection with the community? And it was just incredible, really, to see people blossoming,
Yes.
and families would often say, it's like they're coming back alive.
They're seeing the person they used to be again.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
So then I worked there for about 5 years, and then I went completely freelance when I had my children. So now it's more in private practice that I see people with a whole range of difficulties, but I do tend to see maybe slightly more than other therapists of people that self-harm, just because, that's an area of interest for me.
Yes. And of course you teach the course on self-harm for us as well. So
yes, I do. Yeah.
Now, on to the questions that we've had submitted for you today, and really starting with a very core one. Why do we self-harm?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's lovely, Julia, to hear you saying we.
Yes.
You know, we all self-harm, and this is something, you know, a real sort of thrust in the course that I talk about, and a lot to parents as well of children that are self-harming, that actually we are all on this self-harming continuum. So, you know, if you imagine a continuum, at the beginning of the continuum, when life's going okay, there's no major stresses in life, you know, we're kind of attempting to self-care usually at that point. So we're trying to eat reasonably well and exercise and not overdo drinking or drugs, or, you know.
Yeah.
And then as stress creeps in, I believe we all move up this continuum where we become maybe a bit more reckless with ourselves. We, you know, tend to eat a bit more rubbish, or have a few more glasses of wine in the evening, or, you know, dabble in drugs, or do something that we know is causing us harm.
Yes, or even chew our fingernails, I think, because that's sort of
exactly
on that scale as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or, you know, get our house in a real mess and just have no motivation to clear it up. Just, you know, be less self-caring until the point maybe where we're really overwhelmed with emotion of one sort of or another, and we're actually finding ways of harming ourselves as a way of relieving emotional distress. So what we know, for instance, about cutting, which is the most common form of self-harm, is that when we injure ourselves in some way, so actually it's cutting, but it's also things like head banging, or often, well, it's a generalization, but more commonly with boys and men, getting into a fight, you know, provoking a fight or hitting a wall, you know, causing some kind of injury, which may not be labeled maybe as self-harm, but has absolutely the same mechanism in it. When we cause our body injury in that way, endogenous opiates are released into the bloodstream. And the reason for that is for our survival. You know, so if we were an animal in the wild who'd been attacked, we have this release of hormones into the system to be able to move away and survive and be safe.
Absolutely, yes. So that's the same system that's working. If you, because I was thinking about this before the podcast, before this recording actually, and thinking, you know, if I cut myself when I'm chopping vegetables or something, there's that initial panic, and then the kind of sit down, tend to it, pay attention to it, bandage it, whatever, and then there's really quite a nice calm feeling.
Yes, exactly that. And, you know, people that self-harm regularly cite that for the reason that, you know, some people call it kind of zoning out, or, you know, floating above myself, that sense of, you know, there's a sense of almost dissociation with more severe injury.
Yes. So then the addiction that develops as an addiction almost, does it? Would you call it that?
It can. I mean, in the same way that with any other addiction, if your environment is healthy, if you're getting your needs met, it's unlikely to develop into an addiction. But if your environment is unhealthy, you're not getting your needs met, it has great potential to become addictive. And, you know, the whole expectation fulfillment theory kicks in then when, you know, when we're imagining self-harming, we get the shot of dopamine. And you know, this is really, really important in terms of how self-harm is treated and approached.
There's one that I think you have actually answered here. Is there a difference between self-harm and self-injury?
So the difference is that when we refer to self-injury, generally in literature, it's behaviours where we're purposefully injuring ourselves. But you know, the literature can be quite confusing, really, and those terms can be used interchangeably. But, you know, self-harming really is any behaviour that causes you harm, but you feel compelled to do in moments of distress. Self-injury is within that, but it's maybe a little bit more specific in terms of actually injuring oneself, you know, causing injury.
I see, yes. So self-harm could include gambling, whereas self-injury wouldn't really include that because that's more of a bodily thing.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I
Brilliant.
think, it is so incredibly helpful to think of self-harm on that continuum, because then we can identify with that, the process that's going on for somebody who's self-injuring. Because so
Yes.
often, other therapists I supervise will say, I just can't get my head round why you would want to injure yourself. And actually, when you
Yeah.
think of it in the same way as, well, why do you, when you've eaten one massive piece of chocolate cake, feel desperate to have another one, even though you feel sick? Or, why are you drinking a third glass of wine, even when you know you've got to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah.
It's that same desperate need to soothe yourself.
Yes. And even I think exercise is included in this, isn't it? People
Definitely.
who sort of obsessively
Yeah.
run that extra 10 miles or whatever.
Yeah. Even though you've, sprained your knee, or,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what sort of age would you say self-harming behaviors can start? Or is there no lower age limit?
Well, I mean, hospital admissions, I mean, again, the statistics are tricky, because they come from different methods of recording. But if we look at hospital admissions, so that's A&E admissions, when people have got to that point when they're injured enough to go to A&E,
Yes.
the earliest recorded admissions are around age 5, which is pretty young,
Wow.
really. Yeah. And that age group, it's uncommon, but sort of, 7, 8, it's becoming more common. And
Yes. So
the
sort
average,
of the age of reason, the sort of
yes,
7-year-old starting to
yes,
think more. Yes.
exactly, becoming more aware of, comparisons, and am I good enough, and those types of concepts.
Mm.
Um,
And possibly at that age, do you think copying someone who's older than them in their...
possibly, yeah. I mean, that isn't particularly written about, but it's a definite possibility. I
Yeah.
mean, the sort of most common ages is sort of 11 to 15. That's where we've seen a sharp increase.
Right. Yes. And this is very much in the news at the moment, isn't it? On the internet and social media,
Mm,
we can find images and information about self-harm. And of
mm,
course, some of that's very helpful, but as is in the news at the moment, others seem to be almost glorifying self-harm
mm,
and maybe calling it a good coping mechanism.
mm,
So someone, especially in that 11 to 15-year-old age group who's suffering from emotional distress, might see that as a positive option. So what are your thoughts about that, and how we can maybe teach our children that it's not a good coping mechanism?
I think, I mean, as parents, there's lots of things that we'd want to talk to our children about as not desirable coping mechanisms, like alcohol and drugs and being promiscuous and gambling. And I think it comes into that same bracket now, because, as you say, it is much, I started doing the workshop 10 years ago, and it was still a pretty taboo subject at that time. A lot of
Yeah.
people didn't even know what it was. Certainly young people wouldn't have known what it was. So in
Yes.
some ways that exposure is very positive, because the people who are self-harming feel less isolated and less stigmatized. But of course, as you've said, that it's a double-edged sword, because it could be exposing young children to something they knew nothing about. So the literature does suggest, and the studies that have been done with young people suggest, that the most helpful thing to do is be very open and honest and straight talking about self-harm. So, there used to be this idea that if you mention self-harm or you mention suicide, you almost give somebody an idea,
Yes.
you
Yes.
know, like, oh yeah, I've never thought of that.
Yes.
Actually,
Yeah.
the opposite is true, that if we're just quite upfront about it, and we just say, this is something that some people do, and
And presumably explain how it's working.
yes, exactly. I mean, my daughter is 8, and we've already started talking about alcohol and drugs, because she sees that, and we've, it's really the kind of the boss and the secretary model of addiction
Yeah.
in child friendly language. So we talk about, it's they're like bullies, drugs and alcohol, and they bully you into thinking they're going to really have fun with you, but actually it's all a trick.
Yeah.
You know, and I think you could talk in terms those sort of terms about self-harm, that it can seem that might be something that could help you, but actually it's tricking you. And,
Yes.
And ask
Yeah.
them, you know, what do you think could be the not so good side effects of that? What might not be good? You know, get them
Yes.
to start thinking about it.
How fascinating. Of course, the boss secretary thing is much more explained in our addiction book and one day course. But of course, there's, as with so many addictions that, as well, there, in a sense, it is a coping mechanism. It's not a good one, but it is one. So how would you suggest helping as people to stop seeing it as a coping mechanism?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, you know, we never want to be going in with the expectation of stopping somebody. So, you know, traditionally in statutory services, this is a real drive. You know, when someone comes in, for instance, to a mental health unit, it's, you know, how are we going to prevent this person from self-harming? But as I sort of started to say earlier, that it's extremely important that we don't just try and stop somebody self-harming when they don't have another coping mechanism.
Yes.
Because, you know, if you think about that, the influence of dopamine in behaviours, if somebody is relying on self-harm as their coping strategy, and they're in a situation where they're being prevented from using that coping strategy, you know, the dopamine laced memories are, you know, coming at them full force. And this can lead to situations where actually someone will self-harm far more destructively and more dangerously than they would have done if they'd had a clean blade or, you know, whatever it is that they would have used.
Right, so, I see the danger there. Yes, so they've tried not to do it. They've been told not to do it, so they haven't got their normal routine.
Yes, exactly. And in the workshop, I show a video of two of the women that I work with in the Women's Mental Health Service, and one of the women in that video talks about a time that she was in a medium secure unit where she was supposedly prevented from self-harming, and she actually managed to get somebody to bring in a lighter, and she set herself on fire.
Oh my goodness.
Thank goodness she survived. But, you know, she says very clearly in the video, and, you know, I obviously knew her and we talked about it, she said there would be no way on earth she would have done that if she was able to just cut herself with a clean blade superficially. But she'd been left, you know, in this kind of isolated situation. Her emotional needs were, you know, sorely unmet. And all she had really was her dopamine-laced memories spurring her on to think, well, I've got to do it.
Got to do something, anything to get that.
Yeah.
Yes. So in effect, if the onus is on stopping the self-harming at all costs, that could affect, make their mental health situation deteriorate further.
Definitely. It does, without a doubt. And in the service that I worked in, at the time, it was quite controversial and quite pioneering, in that we had the only medium secure unit where women were allowed to have objects there that they could self-harm with. And usually what happens in that kind of unit is initially the self-harm rates go up because they're testing it all out. Really.
Yes.
Really, you're really going to let me do this? Yeah. But actually then the rates dropped right off, and, you know, women got to a point where, you know, they hadn't been in years and years and years because they've been in settings where they've been prevented. But of course, alongside that work, you're working with the individual to develop positive ways of coping. So you're not, you know, it's, you know, the bad press around harm minimization is, you know, oh, you're just kind of letting them get on with it. But of course, that's not the case. It's very much in a very nurturing environment where emotional needs are at the core of the work, and opportunities to meet those needs and build themselves back up, so that actually, you know, once the needs are so much more met in balance, the self-harming just melts away because there's no there's no need for it.
No need for it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Um, a bit like, I suppose, that study where soldiers coming back from Vietnam
Yes.
sort of miraculously stopped taking drugs, but of course it was because they were getting their needs met again in their family and
Yes.
local environment.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Exactly. Exactly that.
So moving on slightly, what this is another question for you, Emily. What should I do if I think someone is self-harming?
I guess it depends who it is and who you are. You know what your role is. The key things to do are to be very open and very non-judgmental in your approach. So you know, to make sure that that person knows that you are available and that you care and that you want to listen. So in the workshop, again, one of the exercises we do is, you know, if somebody is wanting to talk to you about their self-harm, that we just listen. You know, because it is obviously such an emotive subject, particularly for parents, you know, of children that are self-harming. You know, being a parent myself, the thought of it is just it's unthinkable, isn't it?
Yes,
Your
absolutely.
child harming themselves.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it actually is making sure that the parents feel supported, that they, you know, so I often as a therapist see parents to support them so that they can be really available for their children and really listen to why they're at that point.
Yes.
So that
and of course, again, understand the parents also need to understand the process, the dopamine,
yes,
what's going on physically.
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So you need to explain that if you're working with a parent, and so that you know, so that you're enabling the parent really to tune into the reasons why someone has got to that point.
Yeah.
So really the emphasis is on not on the self-harm and certainly not on stopping it, but much more on what can I do to support you? How can I help you?
Yes. And listening, I'm guessing here that, especially with a young teenager, they might not really know or be able to put into words why they're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, just spending time, I know that's difficult when we're all so busy, but trying to just ring fence time for you and your teenager to just be, you know, whether that's going for a walk or going for a swim or going to the cinema, or it may, you know, exactly as you say, it may not be words, but it may be about you just being alongside them.
Yes.
And being available. You know, in the women's service, it was a real struggle recruiting support workers that would be happy to just sit in a lounge and wait for somebody to come and talk to them.
Yes.
But actually, it's what we repeatedly got told from our clients, that was what was so lovely, that people were just available. They weren't rushing around doing other stuff. They were just there and then really listened. You know, without making suggestions, without telling you to stop, without telling you you're wrong, without trying to bargain with you or say, you know, if you do this again, this is, you know, all of that stuff is so unhelpful. To just be really present and listen.
And have time. And this chimes so well with, I don't know if you have listened to the podcast I did recently with Chris Dias.
I did.
And that quote from a child, I think, I wish I'd had someone to talk to while I was waiting for someone to talk to.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's so telling, isn't it? That
it really is. Yeah.
Everyone gets put on a list and you have to wait.
Yes, exactly. And actually it isn't, you know, I think from my experience of working in that service, it was often just, it was the support workers that people made real friendships with.
Yeah.
You know, professional friendships, of course, but you know, they could be, as you say, on a waiting list to see a so-called expert psychologist or psychiatrist. But actually, it was the relationship that they formed with someone there that they could trust that was the most healing.
Yes.
You know, in the literature around self-harm, we talk about relational security rather than physical security. So it's moving away from this notion of the only way you can help someone move on from self-harm is be in an environment where there's nothing they can self-harm with. So the environment is somehow supposed to be secure which of course it never is.
Never can be.
Never can
Yes.
be. But actually the real security, as we know, which is one of our, very important emotional needs, comes from trusting relationships.
Yeah.
And that's actually where we can move on once we feel heard and understood and validated.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Now, and Emily, do you think self-harm is on the rise, or is it just that, as you mentioned earlier, that it's sort of more spoken about now?
Yeah, who knows really, is my answer.
Yeah.
I mean, the statistics show it's massively on the rise. There was a big NHS study that studied rates of GPs reporting people coming with self-harm. So they studied it from 2007 to 2014. And it showed that in that time, the rates of boys reporting self-harm doubled and the rates of girls trebled.
Wow.
I know. But, it's so, whether they were all self-harming before that time, but they didn't have the courage to go and seek help, or they felt too stigmatized and now they feel less stigmatized. And
yeah,
you know what I mean? It's very difficult to really know, but what we definitely know is that it's being much more widely reported.
yes.
Which
is all we can go on, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I definitely think, for young people, they are much less isolated with the problem, which is encouraging. But
yes, of course. Yeah. So the sort of next step is to get the news out, which you're doing so ably, about the why and what can be done about it in terms of getting needs met and everything.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the challenge, I think.
Yes. Now, it's something that actually I came across a wee bit, but I'd love to know your response to this. Why, for those who have cut themselves, how do you then help them? You've probably hopefully gone through the needs and resources and how to get their needs met more effectively. But then, of course, they're going to have scars, physical scars. How do you help them with those physical scars that they're left with?
Yeah. I think things like self-massage can be very helpful. Manuka honey is known to be very healing. So some people I've worked with, I've encouraged them to massage in Manuka honey, which helps with the healing, and other oils, so that there's the kind of metaphor of almost that self-caring and almost taking care of that vulnerable part of you.
Yes.
There's so much useful stuff in self-compassion, and the theory on that, of kind of really nurturing yourself and really kind of nurturing that vulnerable part of you that did that.
Yes. And I suppose almost, I'm sure you go into more detail in your workshop with this, but I'm just also thinking it's a bit like any old injury. It's something that you take a bit more care of, and you actually almost store the memory of that bad time in there.
Absolutely. And I think, as human givens therapists, there's lots of metaphors that we can use about that. There's a lovely one of that a woman that lived in a beautiful house with this amazing window over her stairs, and it was beautifully done with ironwork, and then one night there was a terrible storm and it crashed into a million pieces, and she spent weeks putting it all back in a mosaic, and it created the most beautiful light coming through her window into her house. Those kind of metaphors can be really helpful, I think. And also tattooing. Some clients I've worked with have tattooed over scars with really positive messages or just images that they like. There was a guy in Dublin who was doing this for free. I'm not sure if he's still doing it.
That'd be amazing. Yes.
Name, but I could post a link.
Yes, that would be great. That's such a good idea, isn't it?
Yes. So I think some people have found that very helpful.
I like that. Again, so moving slightly into a different realm, but it's all on the same theme. Is there a link between self-harm and suicide?
I'm really glad we've got that question, because again, you know, in my past in the NHS, there was a lot of assumptions made when people were severely self-harming that it was a suicide attempt, without actually asking the person that did it. And actually, what the research shows is that they are very, very separate acts most of the time. So there is a link in that if you have severely self-harmed, so you've got to the point where you've been admitted into A&E, you're about 100 times more likely to kill yourself in the following year.
Wow, that's amazing.
So, and that's about, you know, you getting to the point where you are really being self-destructive, that the step on to suicide is obviously a lot smaller than somebody who hasn't committed that kind of self-injury. But having said that, you know, the other you know, a really sort of a point I drive home in the workshop is that we really have to be, again, really honest and straight talking about self-injury. And if someone has self-injured quite significantly, to ask the question, you know, obviously it's after you've built rapport, but to say, you know, was this actually an attempt to kill yourself, or was it self-harm? Was it you getting through the moment?
Yes, because of course it could be accidental, you know, but given that the process of self-harming is to make yourself feel better.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's a very different act, as you say. Yes.
It's a very different intention behind the act. And obviously you know, if someone was actively suicidal, you would want to approach that very differently to someone who's trying to stay alive. And again, in statutory services, I think that confusion can be really unhelpful, because that can lead to somebody being on a kind of suicide watch situation, where they may be in a room with nothing in it and being constantly observed, which actually, if you're trying to stay alive and move on, is so inappropriate.
Completely the wrong end of the stick. Yes,
exactly. So I mean, it's a question that I know historically from supervising students, it's very hard to ask that question, but actually it's really paramount that we do, that we're very sort of straight talking about that.
And clear about it.
Yes.
And I would imagine the person in question would want to make that distinction, you know. I absolutely wasn't trying to kill myself. I was trying to make myself feel better.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think, you know, in sort of the police circles and A&E and ambulance circles, it can be quite hard to sort of accept that, you know. So I've heard some, particularly ambulance people, saying, well, you know, if you're going to go that far, you must have known that there was a chance you'd want to die. And I think that is it's a tricky line, isn't it? That if you are being very reckless, you know, somewhere in your mind that there's a chance. But of course, with any other addiction, with self-harm, with self-injury, tolerance builds up. So
you have to do more to
go
get the same
further and
effect.
further. Exactly. So it's definitely something we need to, you know, hold in our minds when we're working with people who are severely self-harming.
Yeah, absolutely. This next question, I think you've really answered, but there's a slight twist in it. How can we prevent self-harm and show that life is enjoyable and worthwhile?
I think it's, you know, it's what we would do as human givens therapists. You know, it's help people create a life where our emotional needs are met. So, you know, as I know most human givens therapists do, in that first session, it's about helping someone build hope. So, you know, really asking them the miracle question, beginning to build up a picture of what their life will be like when they've learned new coping strategies, when they've started engaging in things that make them feel alive, and, you know, started meeting people they want to see again. And so that we really use the tools like guided imagery to build that up, so someone can imagine an alternative to being stuck where they are now.
Yes, that's it, isn't it? Getting that image, that future picture.
Yes, exactly. And I think for some people that is in tiny steps as well. You know, if you're working with someone who's got a long history of self-harm and is really stuck, it might be really tiny what you're working on.
Yes, and may not have any good images from the past to draw upon. if their whole childhood's been difficult.
Exactly. So that can be much trickier.
Yeah.
So it's almost, you know, using the reality generator to start thinking what that might be like if they could imagine it.
Yes. Yeah. And then another question along the same lines: how can you build self-esteem and self-love, which of course slightly ties in with the Lee Pycroft interview I did about image and you know, she's an international makeup artist but has turned to the Human Givens approach for that element of how to build self-esteem, how to make us feel good about ourselves. What are your thoughts on that?
To me, it comes back to the needs again.
Yeah.
Really, Julia. You know, I guess particularly about building intimate relationships. You know, building relationships where you can feel you trust somebody, and that may well be initially with you as a therapist. You know, if they haven't got people in their life that they feel they can trust, having a relationship where they feel supported and validated is often the first step, I think, to developing self-esteem and self-love. And then obviously starting to do activities and occupations or whatever it is that actually give you a sense of achievement and competence, which we know leads to self-esteem.
Yes. Yes. And the last couple of questions here, which I think could be sort of wrapped into one. Can self-harm be overcome, or is it a continuous journey? Oh well, I'll stick with that one first, and then there's a sort of final one.
Okay. I definitely think it can be. I know it can be overcome. You know, I've worked with people who couldn't have imagined they would have stopped self-harming, and they have. Or it might be something that on very rare occasions they would go back to. There was a big Australian study, the only historical study actually of self-harm, that started in the 90s, and they followed a group of young people. So they started interviewing them at about age 13, and they followed them through to their late 20s, looking at all kinds of mental health indicators. And what they showed was that in the beginning, in the kind of early teenage years, about 10% of girls and about 6% of boys were self-harming. And by the age of 29, only 10% of that 10% and that 6% were still self-harming. So, and that was a completely random group. So they weren't receiving any particular treatment. They would, you know, it was just a naturalized study. And I think that's really indicative. It was quite a large cohort. It was about 2,000. That most of the time self-harm dissipates. In the same way that, you know, all the other things that teenagers, you know, that we experiment with, drugs and drink and being promiscuous and gambling, you know, those things most of the time, if your needs are met and your environment's healthy, will slip away.
I actually worked with someone who self-harmed through cutting, and she, which may be the case with others, she had a little penknife, and that was her favorite sort of, you know, she could obviously have used other knives, but that's what she used. And this was always kept in her back pocket. And the moment where she actually gave up, even though she hadn't self-harmed for a long time, the penknife was always there. And the moment she actually realized she'd stopped was when she chucked that knife out. So that was a sort of a bit like we do in the rewind. She actually threw it away.
It away, And I mean, you hear that a lot with smokers, don't you? That you know, when they're giving up, they'll still carry a packet of fags with them.
Yes, or their lighter, or
So I think it's quite an individualized thing. But I think such an important thing when you're working with self-harm is to have hope, you know, and to convey that hope to that person that their life can be really different. You know, and that this is their way of coping now.
Yes, absolutely. And just finally, how should we react when we see old scars from self-harm? Is that a positive? This person's overcome self-harming behaviours,
Mm.
or, oh, is this person still vulnerable?
Yeah. I think I would ask them. You know,
Yes.
in terms of, you know, in my first session, I would always ask, you know, whatever they've come with, has it ever got to a point where they've thought about harming themselves, or have actually harmed themselves? And ask them about that. Just, you know, routinely I would do that, so that they would be able to tell you whether that was more recent or something that they did a while ago, you know, because that's obviously a major factor of how recent the scars are.
Yes.
But I think the point there is to not be scared of asking, you know.
Yeah, because otherwise it's the elephant in the room, isn't it? You know,
Yeah,
sort of.
exactly. And then somehow, you know, everything else is acceptable, but not that. You know, it's so much work can be done about just being really open and a matter of a fact, and normalize, not normalizing the act, but normalizing the fact that we all do different things in order to cope.
Yeah.
And it,
Yes.
yeah, the respect that you convey through that is very important, I think.
Yeah. Yes. Fabulous, Emily. Well, that's the end of the questions, but is there anything you'd like to add that you feel we haven't covered?
We've probably covered everything.
Yeah. Oh, good. That's brilliant. Brilliant.
Saying.
And I know your one-day workshop day, Overcoming Self-Harm. Now, I'm assuming that's for all comers, for therapists and people who are having difficulties themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've certainly had people who are, you know, working to overcome self-harm themselves, and also parents
And
of
parents, of course, yes.
yeah, who are in
Yeah.
that situation, who I think have, well, I hope they found it helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. Well, my thanks to everyone who's listening. I'm sure you will have found this time very interesting, and especially to all those who took time to submit questions for Emily. Thank you very much. I hope you've felt they've been answered fully. And of course, thank you, Emily, for taking the time with us today.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's certainly been a very, very interesting conversation for me, and I'm sure all this information and advice has been interesting and helpful for listeners. Now, if you'd like to learn more about self-harm and how to give people the best chance of stopping, Emily's one-day course is called Overcoming Self-Harm, and it's available. You can find it on our humangivenscollege.com website. It's coming to London in March and October of this year. We've only got 2 dates for this year, so spaces are limited. So please make sure you book your place in advance and avoid disappointment. You can book online or at, as I said, humangivenscollege.com, or by phoning our office. And the number is 01323 811 690. Well, I really hope you've enjoyed this Ask the Expert podcast, and thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a great day. Bye for now.